Okay.
Good morning, Noam.
Hi.
So, uh, talking about things, just getting straight to it, Sunrise Movement is going into a phase of what I would call renewal in terms of recruiting in schools and recruiting in communities. Uh, the fight for what we call climate justice is something quite urgent, as you know. And I'm wondering what you say. What is the state of where we're at in this fight? What do you see when you're looking?
Well, I should perhaps begin by saying that the person you really ought to be talking to, I think, is my daughter, Aviva, who is just doing a lot of work on climate justice, just has an important book on it. I mean, as she and others point out, it's not just a matter of science. I mean, you can think of ways of cutting back heating the atmosphere. The question is how it's going to be done that will allow people to survive in a decent way, even move to a better world. So one thing that surely has to be done, actually, my colleague Bob Pollan has been doing a lot of work on this, is ensuring transition programs for people who are going to be losing their jobs as fossil fuels are reduced. So we hope, unfortunately, they're not being reduced, but we have to get to the point where we're cutting back sharply on fossil fuels, and that will, of course, mean potential hardships for communities, and have to work with them to overcome that. As I say, Bob has been quite successful on that, even getting the mine workers union in West Virginia, a number of unions in California and Ohio to advocate transition programs, which will train workers for different, and in fact, better jobs. That's crucial for getting, first of all, it's just necessary on human grounds, but even tactically, it's necessary to overcome natural kinds of opposition to taking the steps that have to be taken. There's also a huge problem, I don't know how to overcome this, of getting the rich countries to agree to provide substantial funding for the poorer countries of the world to deal with the critical problems. If they don't, we all die. It's not just altruism, but a substantial part of the emissions are coming from poorer countries trying to deal with impossibly difficult problems unless they have significant aid. They're not going to be able to do it. And they could do it, like Africa, which is the fastest growing continent, could simply leap over the fossil fuel stage, just as many countries have done with communications. You don't have to go through all the stages that the West went through. You can go immediately to more advanced stages, like iPhones instead of wires overground, and similarly solar energy instead of the whole fossil fuel infrastructure. There's, of course, very powerful interests opposed to that. The fossil fuel industries and everything around them, but it can be done, and it's just got to be done, or else not only they will be a disaster for them, but we'll all be gone. And unfortunately, it's going right in the opposite direction now. We haven't got a lot of time. There's also a major problem of simply disinformation, which is part of something much broader, the general breakdown of the whole social order is so extreme that people just distrust everything. I mean, by now it's to the point where people are refusing to give their children measles vaccines because who knows what those scientists in the deep state are up to. And, you can really destroy the society that way. In fact, the death toll is going way up.
Sunrise Movement is currently focusing on recruiting in schools. From what I've understood about student activism, there are certain problems. We could talk about those, but the history of student activism can be quite serious as far as I know. And I think about SDS and I think about SNCC as well. And I'm wondering if expectations or conditions like that could be replicated today.
Not only could be, but is being replicated. Now you look around the world, it's young people, students, who are out there in the global climate strike and Extinction Rebellion and the protests at the COP meetings and so on. They're the ones who are out in front. In the schools, you're going to run into a problem in the United States, and that is with the strong anti-education programs of the Republicans. They want to destroy the schools, make sure that the schools don't do anything except teach patriotism and reading and writing, But and you've got these astroturf organizations like the Moms for Schools that prevent the grooming of children, all this kind of stuff. It's unfortunately it's not a joke, and it's not just the United States. Like we happen to spend some time in Brazil, where the right wing is very much like the GOP here, and the Minister of Families in the Bolsonaro administration was giving speeches to evangelical churches about how the Workers' Party is training children for oral sex. That's talking to these huge groups of evangelicals who just believe what their pastor tells them. Well, that's a general phenomenon. It's bad in the United States, not alone. And it's getting worse with the, basically with the whole social breakdown. It was kind of striking in the last election that the Democrats lost even more of the working class than they had already. It's not that these people just don't see anything there for them. Democrats offer nothing. The Republicans at least offer guns. And that's going to be a huge problem.
Huge, but not insurmountable, I imagine. In the past, for example.
Better not be insurmountable. But we should recognize that it's not just climate change, it's across the board.
Sure. When you talk about student movement and you talk about the climate strike, it makes me turn, perhaps there's more hope in thinking globally for Sunrise, and that maybe some sort of bottom-up internationalist alliance of some kind could be built around the pursuit of climate justice. I don't know. I know Earth Strike has aimed towards something like that, but do you know much more about that?
Well, there was the global climate strike, which was a move in the right direction. I don't know how much has developed from it, but you're quite right. There should be an international movement of young people reaching to the poorer countries, to Africa, to Asia. I mean, parts of the world are really facing a desperate situation. I mean, South Asia is just going to be unlivable. The large parts of Africa are going to be unlivable. I mean, one of the worst, which is, I just happened to be giving talks in Egypt and Israel recently, virtual talks, of course. And so I was talking about the Eastern Mediterranean, which is heating up much more rapidly than other parts of the world. And predictions now are that unless radical changes are made, by the end of the century, the Eastern Mediterranean, the sea level will have risen 2 to 2.5 meters, practically wipes out the countries. The populations are all along the shore. That's not very far off. That's the lifetime of young people today.
How would we go about formalizing some kind of international alliance?
Well, personal contacts. It's now a lot easier with social media. Like I can give talks in Cairo and Tel Aviv, like I did last week, and people who are organizing can do the same. And a major international global strike kind of activity could shake things up, I think. Young people, just take Greta Thunberg's formula. You have betrayed us. That's all you have to say. It captures it all. If you want to destroy all of us, admit what you're doing. Don't pretend to be anything else.
Thinking about the context of the United States, within Sunrise, we've had kind of contradictory reception of the Inflation Reduction Act. I know it's better than nothing, but how can we use this to our advantage, you think? And could this somehow end up playing to the advantage of anybody who wants the Green New Deal or anything beyond that?
Well, there's only one way to proceed. That is to expose and condemn the parts of things like the Inflation Reduction Act that were gifts to the fossil fuel industry and which expose the way they're using them, which brings out the essence of capitalist savagery in a dramatic way, which I've really never seen before. I mean, I don't have to go through it with you, but the idea that, say, ExxonMobil can use the credits given for decarbonization to exploit fields in Wyoming that are too carbon heavy for oil, so it can dig into them, pull out the carbon, bury it, get credits under the Inflation Reduction Act, then dig for more fossil fuels. If you ever want to expose the nature of capitalism, couldn't be more dramatic. They're giving it to you on a silver platter. So expose that, show what it means, show why we have to have deep social change. Same time, make use of the positive elements, and there were some positive elements, and develop and exploit them. It's a double-edged policy, but we know it has to be done. And I think it's very educational. You can go to people and say, look, you want to put your fate in the hands of people who are going to use the money we give them in order to dig up more carbon so they can bury it and get more money. I mean, is that the world you want to live in?
You've mentioned capitalism now, and I'm personally relieved. I'm sure I'm not the only one. I can also foresee, even on the left liberal end of things, that putting the issue of capitalism on the table, maybe there's no time for it, maybe it's not the right time, or even it's not politically feasible at this time. But I think that the consensus about the harms done by capitalism is something that we can now talk about. But what do you think about moving this consensus?
I don't think it's an either or. You're right. It's a fact that the timescales require that the practical measures to overcome the crisis be undertaken within a basically state capitalist framework. The time scale for getting rid of that is much deeper and longer, but that doesn't mean we have to stop exposing it. We can do it right away, and that has immediate practical consequences. We can say, look, it's this ridiculous, rotten system of transferring decision-making to the super wealthy that is causing things like not having an authentic Green New Deal, but only greenwashing. So if you want to take out practical measures right now, you have to understand the fundamentally savage and suicidal nature of the system. Let's work on changing them both.
I see. I see. A both and, not an either or. I'll remember that. There are some things that come to mind when I think about the limitations of the Green New Deal, or how people have talked about the limitations of the Green New Deal. One of the things that comes up is the military and the military's use of fossil fuels and carbon and everything else. And the other one has to do with environmental destruction of, say, building solar panels. You're going to exploit the environment over here. And both of these aspects, I haven't found answers to this question of whether these elements of the Green New Deal can be solved, right?
Well, let's take the second, environmental destruction with solar panels. I just saw a study of England somewhere. Turns out that the land used for golf courses is about 5 times the amount used for solar panels. So if we're worried about destruction of the environment, we could start with golf courses for Donald Trump and his friends. I mean, right where I live in Arizona, there's a serious water shortage, but there's golf courses all over the place being irrigated, plus alfalfa being planted to enrich agribusiness by selling it to Saudi Arabia and using up all the water in Arizona so people can't have things to drink. I mean, everywhere you look, you can see the savagery and absurdity of the reigning system and what it's doing to our plans and needs. Yes, solar panels, wind turbines, anything's going to have a downside. There's no possibility of anything pure. But it's a question of comparative costs and benefits. If you're worried about land use, which you should be, get rid of the golf courses, or just take the environmental issues outside of global warming are very serious. Just a couple of days ago, the Biodiversity Convention was signed in Montreal, 200 countries, one country missing, the usual one. Well, I didn't see any headlines about that, but that's work for the Sunrise Movement. Why is the United States the only country in the world that will not sign the Biodiversity Convention, which is critical for saving land and resources? Take the military. I mean, they just passed the military budget, which is almost $1 trillion. It's totally grotesque. Has nothing to do with any defensive purposes, way beyond all other countries put together. And it's part of aggressive actions that are being taken in the Far East, China. U.S. virtually declared war on China a couple of weeks ago with this Biden plan to block any advanced technology going to China. Well, then that's buttressed by encircling China with heavily armed ring of states. So, yeah, and let's have a war with China. That's part of the military budget, planning for destruction, devoting resources, or just and go back to Ukraine. I mean, unless the longer that war continues, the more Ukraine is going to be destroyed, and the more resources are wasted in destruction that are desperately needed for dealing with climate. So everywhere you look, it's all interconnected.
One of the things that comes to mind is the let's say the finite capacity that people have to stay motivated. I remember personally from Occupy Wall Street days, there's this huge explosion, public, a brilliant tactic of public attention, and then everything kind of wilts, Sunrise Movement, of course, has the historic help of AOC, right? And then there's this huge lifting of motivation to get involved and to participate. And we've dealt with pretty severe moments of discouragement, but I'm wondering if you've seen or know about movement history moments where things were able to evolve into more serious programs and sustain a long-term momentum for years.
Well, I'm old enough to remember the days when there was a lively Communist Party in the United States. And most of my family were involved in it back in the 30s. There were a lot of things wrong with it, but there were some things that were right. They were in it for the long haul. It wasn't a tactics-oriented movement like Occupy. Occupy was a tactic, not a movement. You can't keep it up very long by its very nature. Communist Party was all the craziness, whatever you want to talk about. Nevertheless, they were in there for the long haul. There were going to be defeats, but they were going to stick around. And if you needed somebody to run the mimeograph machine, he was going to be there. Okay, that's the kind of movement you need. Socialist movement was like that as well. And the capitalist class understands it. That's why there has been such brutal and vicious attack against any moderately left movement. End of the First World War, Woodrow Wilson destroyed the Socialist Party, totally destroyed it with violence. After the Second World War, communist socialists were destroyed with what's misleadingly called McCarthyism. Point was to get the militant activists out of the unions, out of any other part of life, demonize them, turn them into objects of hatred. Same right now. The Russophobia now is beyond anything I've ever seen. And it's used just to immediately demonize anyone. Henry Kissinger attacked as a Putin lover because he said maybe we should think about peace or something. I mean, this is a deep, long-standing feature of the American social economic system, with a highly class conscious business class constantly fighting a vicious class war, never relenting, and you just don't get permanent movements. Every movement that comes, like Sunrise, has to begin from scratch. Doesn't pick up from a long-lasting tradition, like, say, the Communist Party. Well, that's something. Same with SDS. Grew out of nowhere. There was no background. Had to invent everything for themselves. That's a long-standing feature. It's connected with the fact that the United States is so backward in social and economic issues. I mean, you take somebody like Bernie Sanders, who's considered radical left here. I mean, in Europe, he'd be centrist politician, calling for universal health care. How radical, Mhm.
It's funny because when there's a really nice clip of him in front of a Fox News audience, and he asks them, is expecting universal health care radical? And they all say, this is a Fox News audience, and they all say no. And he really put his faith in the common sense of people to kind of transcend these ideological barriers.
He's right.
It worked
He's
too.
right. Instead of the slogans, talk about the idea, the policies.
This makes
I mean, if the Democrats had any intention of becoming a popular party, they could have saved the Build Back Better legislation by doing something they refused to do. Go to the people with the individual programs and say, do you want this program? Everybody says yes. Do you want that program? Everybody said yes. Do you want Build Back Better? No, because that's the government taking over. Well, you can overcome that by not accepting the terrain that the right wing establishes.
One of the more recent books about climate change is by a guy named Matt Huber, I believe is how you pronounce it. His book is called Climate Change as Class War. And in Sunrise Movement, class war may be operating in the background, right, amidst, let's say, race and gender politics alongside it. When I talked to a Starbucks workers union member named Len Harris, I told her that I thought it was peculiar, and I think this is part of the success of that wave, that when you put class consciousness out front, it seems to get past a lot of these more divisive areas, which are nevertheless important. And I'm wondering how you see, let's say, a class first style of analysis playing into the climate justice movement.
I think it's the right movement. That's what happens when you organize mine workers in West Virginia to say, yes, we're going to work for a transition program. We want our lives. They can even go on and say, we want to work for a transition program in which we take over the energy system, not hand it to some rich bankers in New York. You can do that too. I mean, it's worth remembering Tony Mazzocchi, not that long ago, the He was one of the militant activists in the oil atomic workers, chemical workers union, and he was a radical anti-capitalist and a militant environmentalist. And in fact, that union was right in the forefront back in the early 70s of environmental regulations. And they're the people who see it firsthand. You're a chemical worker, you don't have to be told about pollution. You don't have to read a book about it, you know. And he tried to organize a labor party back in the 90s, but couldn't get enough traction. But that's the kind of thing that should be done. Working people on the front line ought to be right in the front of the climate change movement. They're the ones who suffer, their communities suffer, their families suffer, their children are going to be wiped out. They can be mobilized to work on it, but on class issues, not by asking them what pronoun to use.
Appreciate that. Do you see prospects for victory in this very long and unlikely struggle? Do you see a light at the end of the tunnel here? This is a very long night.
We don't know, so we have to assume that there is. I don't know if you've ever read the Analects, Confucian Analects. It's interesting. One of my favorite lines in it is they describe the most honorable, elevated person, the master himself. He's the person who keeps on struggling, even though he knows there is no hope. Well, we don't have to go quite that far, but
There are a million questions here, and I'm trying to pick out some. I think of interconnections with other moments of the left, right? We mentioned Occupy now. This one comes from a friend of mine. I imagine that he sees a linkage between the water is life, Keystone Pipeline, struggle for indigenous rights as connected with the climate movement. And I wonder how you can form a coherent agenda out of all of these different moving parts, and what does it mean to have a serious program come out of all of these differences?
well, take indigenous people. A very striking fact that all over the world, the indigenous populations are in the lead in struggling against destruction of the climate. It's true of First Nations in Canada, tribal groups in the United States, like Keystone Pipeline, Aboriginal people in Australia. In Brazil, it's the indigenous populations that are out in front to try to save the Amazon. In India, tribal people. I mean, they're way out in the future. We're so-called civilization is way behind. And we had to listen to them. They're very eloquent. They're doing things. We can move forward with them. You look at indigenous people, young people, that's where the hope is. And so they can perfectly well be talking to miners in California and saying, look, we're all in this together. There isn't going to be any California if we keep this up.
That makes me think of, there for moments where a struggle goes popular, like with George Floyd's murder, Black Lives Matter takes off. or Masa Amini in Iran, right? There's a social tragedy. There's a travesty that seems to strike at people. It gets to their empathy with each other. They come together very quickly. When Jackson, Mississippi is flooded, and when New York has subway stuff get flooded, I kind of wonder why there's not a similar point where we go, stop. We need to come together around this. And I'm wondering, does is there is it just a different process, you think? What do you think is going on there?
Well, I think you think about the examples you gave, those are individual events that led to a tactic. Well, a movement that's ongoing, long-term, established goals can make use of particular moments and tactics. But if that's all the movement is, it's going to die. You can't have a movement based on tactics. And if you do use tactics, you have to think them through. So take the Black Lives Matter. The slogan that came out of it right away was defund the police. Well, it's not a bad idea if you think about it seriously. There's plenty of police functions that should be handed over to social services, and police salaries can be raised so that they have decent training and so on. That's the way Bernie Sanders, AOC, a couple others formulated defund the police. It's not what lasted. The right wing took it over and turned it into let criminals run in the streets. Well, you got to think about that when you formulate slogans. The right wing is there, ready to pounce anytime you make a slight mistake, and they're going to leap on it. You have to be ready for it. You want to talk about defund the police? Don't produce that slogan. Produce the actual program you're proposing. Let's remove police from work they shouldn't be doing, and that social workers should be doing as well or better. Let police concentrate on police work, be better paid, better trained. And if there's a family dispute, send in social workers. If somebody's has an overdose, you don't have to, or a lost dog, you don't need the police. I mean, I've had that. We live out in the suburbs. You see a dog roaming around that's obviously lost. What can you do? You call the police. Right. It's ridiculous.
Right. Any thoughts on degrowth?
Well, what does it mean? I mean, if we're going to have solar panels, if we're going to have mass transportation, they have to be built. So that's growth. If you want to get rid of too many cars on the road, that's degrowth. And you need something, you want to grow in some areas and decline in other areas. I don't think degrowth itself is a slogan. Does it mean we should stop trying to get efficient mass transportation? It's ridiculous. But that takes a lot of development. So, you can see the point where there's a lot of very wasteful overconsumption, which has, in fact, the business world devotes hundreds of billions of dollars a year to try to elicit useless consumption. That's what the advertising industry is about. Okay, that's something that people should be educated about, and turn to more useful and more healthy, better things. But there's going to have to be growth if we want to get out of the dangerous climate crisis. Everybody agrees with that.
Hang on, there's one coming. Uh, I appreciate this. Hang on. When I'm thinking about international, like say for example, Chinophobia along with Russophobia, right? The prospect of serious international cooperation seems like we're getting further and further from it. So is there a linkage, a necessary linkage, let's say, between anti-war politics and climate justice politics?
Yeah. Let's go back to 1945, not that long ago. You asked people, is there any hope of France and Germany cooperating? Inconceivable. Right now, they're close allies. Yes, it's possible. Not only possible, but necessary. There has to be accommodation with Russia, China, for us to escape our joint problems. None of the major problems we face have borders. Those are common problems. We either work together on solving them, or we'll go down to destruction together. And it can happen. I mean, the Germany-France case is a recent example. You go back to 1945, seemed inconceivable.
When I hear this,
And in fact, if you look back over a longer stretch of history, I mean, you can find just how this works. So take the Napoleonic Wars. France was rampaging all over Europe. Finally, Napoleon was defeated. The conservative right-wing statesman, the Tsar Metternich, organized what was called a concert of Europe, in which there were no victors and no defeated. France was brought in. France, which had been destroying the whole continent, was brought in as a common member. It led to about a century of relative peace. Well, that statesmanship happened to be the far right who did it. But we're going to have the same thing now.
when I hear what it takes, it makes me think, how can local organizing, going door to door in a neighborhood, affect an expectation that that's global, you know?
Well, you go door to door and you ask, do you want your tax money to go to new kinds of missiles that'll destroy us and everyone else? Or would you like to have a decent health and education system? That's local organizing.
Do you see that this is kind of a split hair question, but there's argument as to whether if we want electoral leadership, do you want to build it from within the Democratic Party? Even Ralph Nader, I think, said recently that serious progressive representation could come from within the Democratic Party at this point. We have the squad, and there's Bernie Sanders, of course, over here. But then there's, this desire for this pure ideology, or a party that could gather resources and have its own very serious, uncompromising progressive agenda. Which one do you see, or is there a possibility for the latter at all? And then what about the former? How serious is representation for climate justice at this point?
Well, we're not going to have a pure party within the state capitalist society. You could have a party that's concerned with the needs and rights of working people and the poor. You could. There's going to be a violent attack against any effort to create that, but you could work for it. At the very same time, there's no contradiction. You can support those elements within the Democratic Party. If it was 50 years ago, you could have supported those elements within the Republican Party. I mean, I voted for Republicans. There was a time when moderate Republicans and liberal Democrats were not that different. I mean, it's only in the last 30 or 40 years that the Republican Party's gone completely off the rails, and it's just a neo-fascist party. But you could return, and the Democrats could turn to class issues, to issues. They don't have to lose more of the working class every election. They have the right policies, they can win that back. Many people who voted for Obama, believing his false promises, later turned to Trump when they were betrayed not that long ago. And that doesn't change the hope for developing something like maybe Tony Masaki's Workers' Party, Labor Party. Those are not contradictory efforts. They can work and they can support each other. I mean, for the left altogether, I mean, the idea, there is a doctrine in the United States, a reigning doctrine, that says politics consists of going to the polls every couple of years, pushing a button, then going home and let the other guys run things. It's not the left attitude. The left attitude is politics is what you do every day, all the time. Every once in a while, an election comes along, take off a few minutes, vote against the worst guy, go back to work. That's a very different attitude. And a lot of the left is caught up with hysteria, a huge amount of debate and discussion about should we vote, should we not vote. I mean, you know, if you're sensible, you take off a few minutes and you vote against Trump and go back to work. But we shouldn't even be talking about it.
Right. Do you have any thoughts about, I don't quite know as much as I should about this myself, but right-wing responses to the environmental crisis or eco-fascism, and how do we make ourselves as the left distinct from a right-wing environmentalism? I don't really know much about right-wing environmentalism because I know they don't care about the environment.
I don't know much about right-wing environmentalism either. I mean, if there is some serious environmentalism in the right, that's great. I'm perfectly happy to work with them if it's there.
Eco-fascism, I think, refers to kind of isolationist policies as a response to the environmental crisis. So, hmm,
What's an isolationist response?
it means
In,
if water becomes scarce in some other part of the world, let them die. We're going to make ourselves safe here in America.
yeah, you could have that. You could say, I don't care about anything but me and my friends. Okay, let's kill everybody else. I don't see any point in talking about this.
Sure.
There are people who maybe, there are some who are so beyond the level of human nature that if they see a child in the street starving and he has a piece of bread and you want the bread, you just take it from him. I presume there are such people, but that's pathology.
Do you have any thoughts about the role of media conditioning or the manufacture of consent in regards to the climate crisis?
Well, yeah, they should be telling us the truth. They should be telling us clearly. I mean, the things that I just mentioned, like, for example, about ExxonMobil and the decarbonization, you could find that in the media, but it shouldn't be buried somewhere. It should be the headline. That's what you should be telling people all along. There is a self-destructive social system based on private, based on the principle that you mentioned. The hell with everyone else. Actually, it's not novel. Adam Smith wrote about it. Adam Smith wrote that in all ages, the masters of the economy follow their vile maxim: all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. Okay, put that in the headline every day, give examples of it, say, here's what we have to do to overcome it. Now, that's dealing with the climate crisis.
I feel that this has been a satisfactory dialogue myself. Do you have any additional words here?
Get to work. We don't have a lot of time. We know what has to be done. All the problems we face do have answers, but they're not going to solve themselves. It's going to take a lot of hard, dedicated work, a realistic view of the way the world works, and then a willingness to dedicate ourselves to work within it where we can, to change it where we can.
Do you have time for a linguistics question, and then I'll let you go?
Okay.
It's good to see you, Noam. And of course, thank you. A while ago, you sent me a paper. I think I asked you something, and I said, I've been organizing for Sunrise. I've done everything I'm supposed to, and I really want to do something fun. And you sent me back this paper, which had to do with universal grammar and its relationship to click languages. Do you remember this, or do you know the research that I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah.
I couldn't make head or tail of it. I had to tell you. But can you talk a little bit
It's
about
a
the research?
difficult paper. He's a very smart guy, one of the best linguists, one of the best people altogether in the world. Rainey Hoybrecht's an old friend. But what he basically showed was that, I mean, there's no genomic evidence showing that there was a very small number of humans in the early stages of human existence on Earth, a couple 100,000 years ago. But they began to separate. This is in Africa. And the earliest separation was what's called the San people. They speak, they have the same cognitive capacity, same language faculty we have. So it was all in place, but their languages are somewhat different. And they turn out to be the only languages that make extensive use of what are called clicks. I can't make them, but various kinds of things like that, which fit into the language in complex ways. And apparently Hoybrecht's thesis is that when they separated, the mode of externalizing, the internal language is the same, but the mode of externalizing it went in a slightly different direction. So they end up a couple 100,000 years later with click languages, which aren't found elsewhere. And he gives a lot of, I mean, it's complicated business, but that's why the paper was complicated.
But it affirms universal grammar, that the underlying grammatical structure still conforms to those of other languages.
It seems like they have the same internal structure, but different ways of externalizing it. It's not anything very obscure. You have a laptop computer. It has a calculating program in it for multiplying. You can hook it up to different printers. The program's the same. It's just the printer's different. That seems to be the way language works. Internal system is pretty much the same. Can hook it up to different ways of externalizing it.
Right. Noam, it's been a fun hour. It's been a dream come true for me, and it's good to see you again.
Good to talk to you.
Any plans for the new year?
More of the same.
Look forward to it. I'll see you again.
Good.
Thanks.